This is Roger Simon with PJTV, and I'm here with my friend Walid Shoebat. He's a former terrorist and author, and probably one of the leading people in the world watching out for Islamic terrorism and scanning Islamic websites. We have him with us tonight in the wake of a big crisis in New York. That, of course, is the possible building of the Ground Zero Mosque by Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf. Let me start this off, and then you're going to do most of the talking. I'm talking too much. I'm going to read one paragraph from an article by Abdul Rauf from the New York Daily News. There's a method to my madness, bear with me. It begins this way. My colleagues and I are the anti-terrorists. We are the people who want to embolden the vast majority of Muslims who hate terrorism to stand up to radical rhetoric. Our purpose is to interweave America's Muslim population into the mainstream society. Does this track with what you've been reading, Walid, on the Arabic websites?
This is why I've always been arguing. Americans need to understand what Islamic theologians are saying in the Arabic language and not what they say in the English language. What he said on an article in an interview he did with Hadi al-Islam, probably one of the most prominent news media in the Muslim world, in which he was asked regarding establishing an Islamic governance. And he said, throughout, and I quote him, exact quote, throughout my discussions with contemporary Muslim theologians, it is clear an Islamic state can be established in more just a single form or mold. It can be established through a kingdom or a democracy. The important issue is to establish the general fundamentals of Sharia that are required to govern. In other words, you can infiltrate a government that is a kingdom or a democracy, in this case, the United States, and you can proceed in trying to establish Sharia law, similar to what happened in Great Britain. They do it through peaceful means, and they claim to be anti-terrorism, while the agenda is to hide the slick willies of the Islamists in the United States of America to call for more implementations of Sharia laws. This is very clear from his statements in Hadi al-Islam.
And there was another website you told me about, Right for All, I believe. Tell me about that site.
Rights for All is a website that comes from the Cairo University. And in the Rights for All, he was asked regarding religious dialogue. In fact, the article itself was titled, "The most prominent imam in New York says, I do not believe in religious dialogue." And in explaining this, he states, this phrase, that is, religious dialogue, is inaccurate. Religious dialogue, as customary understood, is a set of events with discussions in large hotels that result in nothing. Religions do not dialogue, and dialogue is not present in the attitudes of the followers, regardless of being Muslim or Christian. The image of Muslims in the West is complex, which needs to be remedied. So he does not believe in religious dialogue at all, yet his whole movement is about religious dialogue in the English language. He has this Qurtuba legislation thing, and why would he choose the name Qurtuba? Because you have to understand that in 7/11, that the Islamists began an expedition by Tariq ibn Ziyad that was to Islamize Spain. And prior to that, they used the same methods in taking peoples from Spain who were collaborating with the Muslims to try to infiltrate Spain. So he is modeling what happened in Spain, even in the naming of his organization.
Why do you think he chose the New York Daily News, then, to write the opposite of what he's saying on these other Arabic-speaking websites?
Because the Islamist apologists and the slick willies of the Islamic movement want to use the liberals predominantly because they have an agenda, because since the liberals are looking forward for an Islamic democracy of a sort. And this is the talk of the time, Islamic democracy. We need to establish Islamic democracy. So if he spearheads this idea of Islamic democracy, the doors are open for him in the liberal media. So he uses liberals, and he is funded by many liberals to do his movement in the United States of America.
So they're essentially what Lenin called useful idiots.
That is correct.
He used, I think, specifically the New York Daily News, which is not known as a liberal paper in the sense that the New York Times is, isn't it?
The community in New York are going to object in building a mosque. Imagine, you know, building something where Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, building something, a temple or Japanese, mausoleum or any sort, is kind of an insult to Americans. So he wants to basically ease up the idea of establishing a mosque in the center of ground zero. This to him, because Americans don't understand that establishing a mosque is what is considered in Islamic Sharia as waqf. Waqf is Islamic property. And Islamic Sharia, once you establish a waqf property, it remains to be an embassy to represent Islam forever. It is not permitted in Sharia to demolish or remove it or cancel it. So building a mosque at that point, and in which in the future, if any objects, you have to understand the Muslim world will be extremely violent, because it is unlawful for non-Muslims to dismantle a Muslim mosque, since it's considered an embassy.
Now, apropos of that, you told me a very interesting story offline about that other website, Hadul Islam, and a fatwa that was on there. It sort of jives with all this. Tell us about that.
The fatwa in Hadul Islam was the Muslim was asking for help. He purchased a piece of land, and he learned that there was somebody who was interested in purchasing the land from him, but he was a Christian who wanted to build a church. So he was acquiring for a fatwa whether he is permitted to sell it to the Christian who wants to build a church. And the fatwa was very clear. You cannot sell a piece of property for the establishment of a Christian church, because this infuses the enemies and emboldens the enemies against Islam to have a church in a Muslim land that is purchased by a Muslim.
So exactly the opposite of what they're doing in New York.
Absolutely. And if you look at all the websites that Islamic fatwas are on, anytime you get into marriage with a non-Muslim, you get to a land purchase from a Christian by a Christian, is absolutely prohibited, unless, of course, this woman that you're about to marry must convert to Islam. The marriage of a Muslim girl to a non-Muslim is to be executed by the family. This is, of course, very elaborated in Umdat as-Saliq, which is the Muslim guide in foreign lands. Muslims, by and large, have the Islamic guide. And in the guide itself, it says, if your children leave the religion of Islam, then they must be executed by the family.
Wow. So now this is all going on right at ground zero. What would your advice be to people in New York? How can they educate themselves and put a stop to this before it happens?
Well, they need to educate themselves by learning who this person is. They need to begin to understand that the Islamic theologians in America, you cannot find one that they consider peaceful. There are peaceful Muslims, I call them liberal Muslims, that want nothing to do with Sharia. They want to live in America peacefully. However, we can't find elements in the Islamic organizations in America that are peaceful. There is a litany of statements by all these organizations, whether MPAC, Islamic Society of North America, Council of American Islamic Relation, the MSUs, Muslim student unions, universities, that are loaded with jihadist ideology, very clear, in same sync and in line with the plight of Osama bin Laden's type of jihad. So we cannot trust Islamic organizations to establish a mosque in America. This is not an individual. He belongs to an organization he founded. His father was in the Muslim Brotherhood, admittedly, and he has never condemned the actions of his father.
Regarding Ralph's New York Daily News article, is there an Islamic doctrine about lying to the kufr, the non-Muslim, that we hear about?
That is correct. In Islam, there is what is called at-taqiyya wal-kitman, in accordance to at-Tabari, the famous tafsir or interpretation of the exegesis of the Quran. This is a standard authoritative reference for the entire Muslim world, in which the quote by at-Tabari, if you, in this case Muslim, are under their infidels' authority, fearing for yourself, behave loyally to them with your tongue while harboring inner animosity for them. Allah has forbidden believers from being friendly or on intimate terms with the infidels in place of believers, except when infidels are above them in authority. In such a scenario, let them act friendly towards them. And also Ibn Kathir, he says, whoever at any time or place fears their evil, that is the infidels' evil, may protect himself through outward show. Let us smile to the face of some people, the non-Muslims in this case, while our hearts curse them.
So the Daily News article is an example of that, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So the question becomes is, how do we find out what they conceal in their heart? How do you find out the true thinking of this Muslim? This is why we have to go to the Arabic language. You look at the Fort Hood massacre. Right after the massacre, the Lu'ay Safi of the Islamic Society of North America was invited to give speeches to our troops. Yet, when you look at the Arabic language of what he says every Muslim community needs to establish the proper jihad they need to carry out, in this case being political, financial, or actual terrorism in itself. In fact, Lu'ay Safi was found having some criminal charges as of late in which he is being investigated. So the Islamic Society of North America, Slick Willie's scholars who are concealing in their heart truly what they say in the Arabic language. That's why we have to go to the Arabic. This is why in every single occasion, when people come to me with names, prominent Muslim names, they say, well, this guy's a peaceful Muslim. What about that guy? What about this guy? Do you know, in every investigation I've investigated, every single Muslim scholar that people gave to me that they thought was liberal or peaceful, I ended up going to the Arabic and finding otherwise. Take Hisham Qabbani, for instance. I had this dialogue with James Woolsey. He was the head of the CIA. He says, well, you know, there are prominent Muslim scholars that are peaceful. I says, well, give me one name, just one. And he says, well, Hisham Qabbani. I said, did you see what he writes in the Arabic language? He says, when the Mahdi appears, Christianity will cease to exist. What's he talking about is the obliteration of our constitution and the Christian world altogether. In other words, this Sufi Muslim cleric believes that Osama bin Laden acted in haste. He has no authority to establish jihad. Only the Mahdi can establish jihad. While there are Muslim scholars who don't agree with the terrorism act, they don't agree with it because of the timing aspect of it. And this is why I don't agree with many of the, even people on the right who believe these prominent Muslims are supposed to be peaceful. They're not.
Well, what are we supposed to do then? You're putting people in a very tough box, I must say, Waleed.
What we need to understand is this, and this is why the so-called experts in this country don't really understand the full issue. We need to understand that all Islamic organizations in America, when Islam is an organized form, it's never peaceful. It's always advocates for establishing a Sharia hegemony worldwide. This is the whole goal of the whole movement. While we see Muslim individuals being peaceful, that's true. There are individual Muslims who are peaceful, and there are plenty of them. But the problem is that we're not looking at the organizational forms of the Muslim movements. When we look at that and try to find a single Islamic organization in this country that we think is peaceful, that is accepted predominantly in the Muslim world, we find otherwise. None of them. Name the organization, and I'll show you the litany of statements they made that support Sharia and jihadist movement. So Islam in an organized form needs to be exposed as such, because we don't have movements that are so-called peaceful movements from prominent Muslim scholars. I know people can talk about, let's say, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. But if you ask Zuhdi Jasser, how many Muslim followers do you have? He says less than 100. That's his own words. And when I asked Zuhdi Jasser at a synagogue, how do you justify Muhammad killing the Jews of Banu Qurayza? He says they had a fair trial. Even he has a problem of exposing the jihadist agenda in Islam because he is tied in a bind. If he denounces these things, he has denounced Islam itself and denounced his own religion, because we're not talking about a religion. We're talking about a jihadist movement in this case. Now, I'm not saying that Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a jihadist. In fact, I appreciate what he's doing. He's really intending to fighting the jihadist ideology. But, you know, you can see even with him being a liberal Muslim, there's still these problems.
If the New York situation goes through, if they build that mosque, how will that be seen in the Islamic world? Will it be seen as a great symbol of victory?
Well, it's not only the great symbol of victory. I mean, the question, I was just talking to my mother on the phone, and she said, well, out of all the lands that we have in America and all God's green earth, they couldn't find a place to pray except on ground zero? Why? What's the purpose? The purpose is establishing an Islamic embassy. You have to understand, in Islamic law, a mosque is what is called Sharia Waqf. Waqf is Islamic property in which a mosque becomes an embassy for the Islamic Ummah. And no man in the world is allowed to close down a mosque. Now, if you decide to close it down, this is going to infuriate Muslims globally. So it's going to, the reason that he's doing it because he knows what he's doing. He's creating a struggle between American and American. And, he is winning either way. If he opens the mosque and it ends up being closed, he has basically rallied the Muslim world into creating riots against the West.
Here's my question to you. In reading the Daily News piece that Abdul Rauf wrote, he insisted that it's not really a mosque. It's really a community center akin to a Y, with a gym, basketball court, swimming pool. But there are places people can pray. So what's the difference, or is there a difference?
There is no difference. A place that whenever Muslim come more than one individual, in other words, what they call Salat al-Jama'ah, a community prayer, just like as in the Jewish synagogue, when you have 10, a minyan, they pray in a synagogue. So whenever there is more than one praying in a place, it becomes automatically a mosque because there is more than the place will fit thousands of Muslims praying. So this is clearly just basically a smokescreen to try to cover the agenda of it being a mosque. He clearly says in other statements that it is a mosque. So
that was Walid Shubat, author of God's War on Terror, Islam, Prophecy, and the Bible. If you want to join the conversation, tell us your opinion in the comments section below. For PJTV, I'm Roger Simon.